Beyefendi, sayın milletvekilleri, sayın Serdivan Belediye Başkanı ve değerli misafirler. Serdivan Fikir ve Sanat Akademisi, Uluslararası Fikir ve Sanat Konferanslarının ilkine hoş geldiniz. Kısaca misafirlerimizi takdim etmek istiyorum. Profesör Critchley, 1960 doğumlu İngiliz filozof. 2004 yılından beri New York'taki The New School Üniversitesi'nde felsefe alanında ders vermekte ve kıta Avrupası felsefesi, felsefe tarihi, edebiyat, etik ve siyaset konularında çalışmaktadır. Sydney, Notre Dame, Cardozo Law School ve Oslo Üniversitelerinde misafir öğretim üyesi olarak çalışmıştır. 1994-1999 yılları arasında İngiliz Fenomenoloji Derneği'nin başkanlığını yürütmüştür. Uzun bir süre etik, özellikle de Levinas'ın etiği konusundaki çalışmalarıyla ve Beckett, Wallace Stevens gibi edebiyatçıların eserleriyle felsefe arasındaki ilişkiyi inceleyen metinleriyle tanınır. Uzun yıllar İngiliz The Guardian gazetesinde de yazarlık yapan Critchley, Hannah Arendt'in kurduğu felsefe bölümünün başkanlığını yürütmektedir. Eserleri arasındaki Sonsuz Talep, Kıta Felsefesi, Ölü Filozoflar kitabı, İmansızların İmanı gibi Türkçe'ye çevrilen kitapların yanı sıra mizah üzerine Heidegger'in varlık ve zamanına dair Yapı Bozum ve Pragmatizm gibi birçok kitabı yayınlanmıştır. Süheyb Öğüt, 2006'da Bilgi Üniversitesi'nin siyaset bölümünden mezun olmuştur. Aynı yıl Sabancı Üniversitesi'nde Kültürel Çalışmalar programında yüksek lisansa başlamıştır. 2010'da Bilgi Üniversitesi'nin Kültürel Çalışmalar programından Tesettür ve Pornografi, Egemenliğin iki diferansiyeli başlıklı yüksek lisans tezini tamamlamıştır. Eylül 2010'da başladığı doktora çalışmasını bir Zizekçi olarak Hobbes ve Hobbesçu olarak Zizek başlığıyla tamamlamıştır. 2006'dan itibaren Genç Siviller, Akder, Darülhikme, İlim Evi, İSAR, İLEM ve Serdivan Fikir ve Sanat Akademisi gibi kuruluşlarda kıta Avrupası felsefesi, siyaset felsefesi, sosyal teori, psikanaliz ve sosyoloji dersleri vermektedir. Şimdi selamlama ve teşekkür konuşmalarını yapmak üzere Serdivan Fikir ve Sanat Akademisi Genel Koordinatörü Burhanettin Kanlıoğlu'nu platforma davet ediyorum.
Kıymetli hazırun, değerli misafirlerimiz, hoş geldiniz. Bu ilkini gerçekleştirdiğimiz Uluslararası Fikir Sanat Konferansları'nda sizleri burada görmek çok mutlu ediyor bizi. Müsaade ederseniz kısaca akademiden bahsetmek isterim. Serdivan Fikir Sanat, Anadolu'da yetkin akademik çalışmalar gerçekleştirmek için kurulmuş yerleşik bir akademi. Senede yaklaşık 3000 öğrenci ve yaklaşık 300 akademik program ve ders yapıyoruz. Temel mantığımız yerleşiklik ve kalıcılık. Bu minvalde 7 gün 24 saat açık bir felsefe, sanat ve sosyal bilimler kütüphanesine sahibiz. Bu da Türkiye'de üniversite kütüphaneleri dışında ilk 7 gün 24 saat açık kütüphane. Her dönem öğrenci başvuruları alıyoruz çeşitli programlarımıza ve kontenjan fazlası hayli olduğu için mülakatlı öğrencilerimizi seçerek alıyoruz ve öğrencilerimiz etkinliklerimizden ücretsiz istifade ediyor. Bu öğrencilerimiz her dönem bu akademinin, biz Agorası diye tabir ettiğimiz yerde kendi sunumlarını ve akademik çalışmalarını sergiliyorlar ve sonra bunları yayınlıyoruz. Ve daha başka bir şey, burada gelen öğrencilerimiz buradaki aldıkları dersleri Sakarya Üniversitesi'nde 6 kredilik derslerin yerlerini saydırabiliyorlar. Bu da Türkiye'de bir üniversite tarafından akredite edilmiş ilk organizasyon olarak öğrencilerimiz bundan istifade ediyor. Bu benzeri şeyleri yapabilmek için samimi insanların samimi destek ve emeklerine ihtiyaç var ve minnetlerine ihtiyaç var. Bütün bunlardan dolayı bu faaliyetleri hakkıyla gerçekleştirebilmek için bize sonsuz emeğini, desteğini ve samimi desteğini verdiği için Serdivan Belediye Başkanı Yusuf Alemdar'a çok teşekkür ediyorum. Bugün bu etkinliğin bu çapta gerçekleştirilmesinde büyük katkısı olan Sayın Süheyb Öğüt'e ve etkinliğimizin bir paydaşı olan Turkuaz Medya grubuna çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Ve elbette davetimizi geri çevirmeyen Sayın Critchley'e, bugün bizi kırmayan ve buraya bu felsefi toplantıya büyük bir gönüllükle gelen siz kıymetli haziruna ve diğer misafirlerimize de çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Bugün ilkini gerçekleştireceğiz. İnşallah bu programda bilim dünyamıza sonsuz katkılar sunar ve biz etkinliklerimizi yapmaya ve buradaki bu çalışmaları devam ettirmeye devam ederiz. Katılımınız için çok teşekkür ederim size.
Şimdi konuşmalarını yapmak üzere Profesör Critchley ve Süheyb Öğüt'ü platforma davet ediyorum.
Ses geliyor. Ha, tamam. Simon? Yep, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Very nice to see you all.
My first question will be about love. You remember the documentary on Derrida. The interviewer asks Derrida what love is, and he hesitates to answer that question. Pose your question, he says. Do you remember? Pose your question. And he refuses to answer. But I am tempted to ask it again. I tell myself, what is love? What is your opinion about love? What is the difficulty about love?
Well, love is hard to define. And when we use the term, you know, I love you, then it's often not clear to us really what we're saying and when we're saying it. It's a very hard term to clarify. The way I like to think about love is that in the following formulation, that to love is to give what one does not have, and to receive that over which one has no power. So it's not that one has love, one gives in an act of love, one directs love towards a beloved, someone that you're in love with. But that gift is not something which you possess. So the first thing about love is that love is not possession. When love becomes possession, then it becomes a relationship of ownership, right? which is wrong when it comes to love. The second part of the thought about love is to receive that over which one has no power. So that love is something that one receives as a gift, that you, let's say, you try and, it's something that you receive from someone else, but you do not have power over that. So the paradox of love, one of the paradoxes of love, is that love is a powerless power. It's not, so if love were just the assertion of power over another, then you would reduce that other to property, to possession, to something you can use, have, so on and so forth. for me, what's essential in thinking about love is this idea of, to love is to give what you do not have and to receive that over which you have no power. So what one is doing in articulating a kind of pledge of love is accepting one's powerlessness as a person. I think that's essential. So otherwise love becomes a kind of... The problem with love is that love can become a kind of contract, I love you, you love me, we love each other, and we can buy a house together. Love becomes a kind of contractual arrangement between two parties, a kind of legal arrangement. Now, that doesn't capture the sort of drama of love and the way love feels, I think.
We cannot make a formulation of who we love. We cannot choose, right? We cannot decide. It is something like a miracle or a disaster. It is something exceptional.
Well, it's something, as the Pet Shop Boys said in the late 1980s, love comes quickly, whatever you do. He says that love will happen, but there has to be choice as well. It can't just be involuntary. You have to, as it were.
Involuntary choice, you say?
No, there's a sense in which love is something which happens. You meet someone, and love is also something very particular, right? I mean, this is a question we can talk about in relation to love. How many people can you love, really? And so, but love is love of a particular, and you. It's not something that you can easily generalize, and it's something which is both. It's both something which happens to you. It occurs. It might feel like a wonderful opportunity, a miracle perhaps, and it also requires a decision on your part. You have to pledge yourself.
But your definition of love reminds me the definition of drive in psychoanalysis. You are talking about a lack, but an unsatisfiable and undisplaceable lack.
But the drive is something linked to the body. Right? The drive is...
But life.
Love is more sublime than that. It's more. It's not reducible to that. So, I mean, the question that's linked to what you say is how we think about the relationship between love and desire.
Yeah.
Right? Because we can think about love as in New York last week, the Pope was in town, and everybody seemed to rather like the Pope. And the Pope believes in universal love, which is fine. I'm all in favour of universal love. But when we love a specific person, it's not just a feeling of love, it's also tied to some aspect of our desire. And the question is, for me, the really difficult question is whether we can love and desire in the same place, whether we can hold those two things together. So there is a bodily, physical dimension to love. We're not angels. We might like to be angels, but we're not angels. We're not immaterial beings. We are physical creatures who are born, who live, who die. And we have desires of various kinds. Love is what a physical creature like us can do at its most dramatic and radical. Which is why some people, if you go back to the history of the concept of love, in the Greeks, say the ancient Greeks, love is something physical, it's a force, like a desire, but it's also something that we can direct in a more metaphysical way. It's something not reducible to a physical function. I mean, that's also...
But love can be inclined to, or the object of love can be an abject thing, right? For instance, I can fall in love with my car.
I think it's a different notion of love.
So it is lust, maybe.
No, you didn't like your car. I don't have a car, so I don't. I'm sure. But then we have to make a distinction between, you know, so I like, this is nice water, right? This is nice water. I like that water. I could say, you know, I love this water. Or I love the soup at the hotel. But I don't love that soup in the same way as I love someone that I have a deep relationship to.
What is the very difference between love?
Love is whether you're prepared to, to love. This is where my thinking about love draws on religious traditions, in particular Christianity. And what interests me, for example, in the mystical tradition in Christianity, in particular the way that's articulated by female mystics in the Middle Ages, is that love is a process of undoing the creature in us. So we have this, let's say each of us lives in a kind of narcissistic bubble. We have our world, and now we have a phone, right? And that phone just reflects back to us everything that we already know. And you see people walking around with their phones, right? Everyone's in a bubble. Whatever love is it has to break that down. It has to break down that narcissistic bubble. And that means it's a very dramatic process. It's an even violent process for you. And so when I think about love in relationship to religion, particularly Christianity for me, because that's just what I know, it's a process of undoing or even destroying that ego that one has, that narcissism that one has, in order to make a space open that is large enough for love to enter in. So love isn't something obvious. So when people say, you know, like I live in New York, and people, will say love in a very general sense. There'll be sentences like, I really love Jackie, but, right? I really love Jackie, but she does complain about stuff, or she's such a whatever. So love is introduced as a qualification for then saying you don't like someone. I love but. And so love has become reduced to this service of goods, this exchange of needs that we have, and we lose a sense of the importance of love, the drama of love. And the place where that drama is most alive is in philosophical thinking and in religious thinking. Where in religious thinking, love is directed towards the divine.
Divine.
It's divine. And the question is, what happens when in the translation of love of God, from that translation of love of God into love of the particular person who's in front of you. And I'm a great admirer of the work of Emmanuel Levinas, who wasn't a really profound thinker of love, but his basic idea is that I put it this way. I was watching television the other night. I wasn't watching television, I was watching a movie channel. And the movie I was watching was a documentary about Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish director who I admire enormously. And if you look at the movies of Bergman, Persona, Seven Seals, these fantastic classic films, there's this question about death in his work, and there's a question about God in his work. And there's one passage in one of his late films where a young woman is asking a bishop, surely you believe in God's goodness, in God's love, in universal happiness and redemption and all the rest. And the bishop says, yes, but what I really believe in is in the holiness of the human being. The holiness of the human being. Each human being at each moment. So, going back to this philosopher Levinas, who's a very interesting figure, he said, people often think that I'm a thinker of ethics, that I think about ethics and moral responsibility. And he says, no, my main concern is with the idea of what he calls in French, la sainteté, holiness. And there is a holiness in the dimension of a relationship to the other person, each other person at each moment. And that is a kind of work of love. And of course that's impossible. And that's the point. If we reduce our moral lives and our political lives to a kind of calculation, and we say, well, there are this many people in this room, and they would vote this way or that way, or think this way or that way, or we could, if we do this for them, they'll think this in the following way. We've lost the holiness of the human, right? And the holiness of the human for Levinas, and
Especially in the concentration camps.
well, yeah, that's where it is revealed negatively. Right? Is that at this very moment in this room here with you, I mean, I have a relation of responsibility to each person, right? Infinite responsibility to each person in a way that is just beyond calculation, right? And one can never do enough. So accepting the holiness of the human is a very difficult thing to do. So you might not know.
There's a problem about the microphone. Mine.
I'm gonna have some water.
Okay.
How's everybody doing? Okay?
Interesting. Please. Sorry.
Oh, I stopped actually after.
Okay. We need the holiness of the human being.
Yeah.
For instance, I can hit a stone, but I cannot hit. I can touch a tree, but I cannot touch you.
Mm-hmm.
This means that I make a difference between you and the other present things.
Yeah.
This means that for me, I make a sublimation. This is a process of sublimation. You are more sublime than the other things in the world, and you have to have a prohibition, which means for me a privacy,
Right.
a sacredness, a holiness.
Yeah.
And as far as I can see, without the so-called exceptions, the state of emergencies, war, so on and so forth, the daily lives are established through this process of sublimation. We always sublimate each other, and we have to. And there must be an iteration, an infinite iteration in this affirmation of this prohibition that I attribute to you and you attribute to me. So I am thinking about this infinite iteration of this affirmation of the law of privacy. How can we do it? Is it related to love? Do we love each other? That's why we affirm the law of privacy that is attributed to each other.
Well, if we all love each other, we have a very strange way of showing it. Because the world is full of violence and war and catastrophe and pain, and it's important not to forget that. And what you say is also reminds me of, something that's very important is that if you take the prohibition, you shall not kill. You shall not kill. What kind of utterance is that? What kind of statement is that?
Theological.
Well, it's a statement which finds its location in religion, in Judaism, in Christianity, in Islam. It's a statement which is a very peculiar form, in the sense in which "you shall not kill" is a sentence which is an address to you. Right? You shall not kill.
Yeah.
It's not a law. Right? And there's an important difference between a law, which has an impersonal form, and what we can call a commandment, which has a personal address. So, for example, I could look at the street and say, it is forbidden, it is illegal to park out here. It's illegal to park on the grass here. That statement is an impersonal form. Law is impersonal. It is illegal. But a commandment has the form of an address to you. And that address to you is something you can accept or refuse. So, a commandment, which seems like a very powerful thing, right? Stronger, as if it's, God speaking directly to you, actually is incredibly fragile. A commandment is only sustained by an individual act of affirmation. And in the case that we're talking about, "you shall not kill," it's even more fragile. You could say, we could all say tonight, we don't believe in murder. People are not generally in favour of murder. You shall not kill. But one might find oneself in a situation not far from here, right? What's happening in Syria, where murder is happening, death is happening, and people are driven to violence in different ways. And we have to think about that and think about what that means. It's a very difficult thing. And often, so if we go back to this thinker, Levinas, I was talking about before, I didn't intend to talk about Levinas, it just seems to be happening.
Oh, it's good.
He says that the first ethical imperative, the first moral imperative is "you shall not kill." But he says that imperative arises in a situation of conflict, in a situation where there is a life and death struggle between two people, in a situation of war. And war for this guy, Levinas, was not an abstraction. His family were, in Lithuania, were killed by the Nazis. Most of his family, the rest of his family died in concentration camps. So when he's talking about war, it's not an abstract idea of war, it's a very concrete idea of war. And so we find ourselves in a situation of conflict, war, and we have a guideline of non-violence, a fragile commandment: "you shall not kill." And all that we can do as human beings, morally and politically, is to try and find contexts and frameworks which sustain that. So, I could say tonight that I believe in non-violence. Everybody believes in non-violence. That's fine. The problem is that we find ourselves in contexts of violence. And in contexts of violence, with histories of violence. And the question of how you would sustain a non-violence gets much more difficult at that time. So, for example, let's look at two contexts. there was a young Indian lawyer from South Africa called Mahatma Gandhi, who was a very careful reader of anarchist thinkers like Peter Kropotkin, and he took the idea of non-violence from anarchism and he linked it with a Hindu idea of what he called satyagraha, let's say, non-violence. And he was able, in the context of India under British imperial rule, to engage in a process, a political process of concerted non-violence, of organised non-violence, which is one of the things that led to the end of British imperial rule. So that example, we have an example of how non-violence can become an effective, practical force in the world. The other example is the example of Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist who was part of the opposition to French occupation in Algeria.
Angry psychiatrist.
Yes, and he was, and he thought the idea of non-violence was ridiculous, because in the context of, say, colonial rule in Algeria, it just wouldn't have worked, because the French would have killed it. They would kill people that were protesting. So, non-violence is a guideline to action, a fragile commandment that has to be sustained through individual acts of affirmation, and its plausibility is always dependent upon the context in which one finds itself. And that's very important to understand.
As far as I can see, there are two contexts in terms of the affirmation of the law of privacy, the respect. Privacy and respect. I mean, I respect you. There are two conditions for this respect. I love you, and then I respect your autonomy. And if I don't love you, then the law, the whole juridical system imposes some regulations on me, laws, norms, so on and so forth. Then I find myself that I'm obliged to respect you. But this is contractual.
Privacy was invaded.
So there are two conditions of the possibility of respect. One is love, as far as I can see, and the other is state. But this dichotomy reminds me the dichotomy of saint and the bureaucrat. The bureaucrat does not love the citizen or the colleagues, but the saint loves, the prophet loves. Maybe the teachers that love Allah, God, and devote themselves to the students. Loves, but the bureaucrat does not love. Can we imagine a state, maybe like Gandhi, full of love? Can we imagine a bureaucrat who can really love the citizen, his job?
We can imagine that. Yeah, we can imagine that.
How?
I mean, there's something about bureaucracy, the state, and administration which makes people blind to love, responsibility, and obligation. Right? And so, for most of human history, for as long as human beings have gathered together into groups and formed cities and civilizations, there's generally then been the formation of a bureaucracy, the formation of an administrative class, a police force of one sort or another, a military, a codification of law, and an establishment of hierarchy. If you go back to the ancient cities of Mesopotamia and Sumeria, you find those structures emerging, and they persist. So one conclusion that one could reach from that is that that's all there is. Right? Human life is going to be controlled by forms of bureaucracy which permit kinds of violence. Can we imagine another way? Yeah, I think we can imagine another way. And that's what, for me, I mean, one thing that I'm interested in is not just the imagining of other kinds of social arrangements, but the history of those arrangements. So, to give you a concrete example, I come from England. One way of thinking about English history is that English history is a history of kings and queens, which goes back thousands of years. It's an uninterrupted continuity of tradition. Yeah. And you could buy a book or a tea towel which had all the kings' names leading up to Queen Elizabeth II and whoever comes next, Charles III or William II. And that would be the way things are. But there are other ways of telling the history of a place like England. And I would look at things like the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. I would look at the English Revolution of the 17th century, where people who called themselves diggers went off, left the city, went out into the countryside and began to plant vegetables and cultivate cattle and sheep and to try and organize a different way of life for themselves. And I could tell the history of my country in terms of different moments when that's happened. So, you know, it's a question then of historical memory and how one shapes that historical memory. And you know, another way of thinking about this would be that Walter Benjamin says there is no document of civilization that isn't a document of barbarism. In the sense in which what we think of as our traditions, our ways of life, are often premised upon the depths of the poor, the disadvantaged, those who have no voice, those who did not get to speak, who get the chance to speak. Most people don't get a chance to speak. But another way of looking at history is to try and read history in terms of its silences, in terms of trying to give a voice to those people who were not able to speak, and to look at history in a different way. And that really decides. And the question of who one is a question largely which depends upon the question of what history do you have, and what history is yours. Right? I mean, when I was a student in the 1980s in England, we used to be very keen on the Sandinista in Nicaragua. We thought they were really cool. And the revolutionary freedom fighters in Nicaragua. And one of the Sandinista slogans was that victory is ours because we possess our history. Victory is ours because we possess our history. Which seems like a very strange thing to say, right? That's all you need. All you need at that level is, in a sense, a deep historical self-consciousness of who you are, and then the question of imagining other things. That's important. But this is something that already happened. Right? There was a history. I'm not sure about how it worked in Turkey, but I'm sure that story could be told. but there are counter-historical narratives which allow one not just to imagine forms of life that would be not reducible to bureaucracy, but actually would be practical and effective in the world. And to that extent, you know, so I mean, I'm a utopian in the sense in which, I mean, Oscar Wilde has this. Oscar Wilde, the great writer, and for me a great thinker. Oscar Wilde says, any map of the world that does not include utopia is mistaken, because it does not include that place that human beings keep wanting to arrive at. Right? So utopia is part of the map, right? And utopia is an aspiration. It's a way of it's a moral vision, which for me is grounded in the way in which you understand history. And that question is a question I could answer in relation to who I am, where I'm from. It's a question which you have to answer in relationship to who you are and where you're from.
But on the other hand, love always implies an instability, right? Like a fire. When I love you, I always think about you and I find myself, yeah, because of that situation, in a state of paranoia. Does he love me? Did I?
Right.
You understand?
Yeah.
So, if a bureaucrat loves and thinks in a way not rational, but in a state of love, can he do his job?
No.
Perfectly.
No.
So, this question may be related.
That's the point.
Related to marriage, maybe. Marriage is an institution. But I don't want to live in an institution.
Right.
But on the other hand, if there is no institution, I cannot manage to continue my relationship with my mind, my love. So marriage maybe can be the marriage of love and institution. It should be. But
Hegel thought so, yeah.
Yeah, but there is a real.
Which should be a cause of concern.
What should we do in this sense?
I don't know. It's I was well. First of all, yeah, love is fire. Yeah. There's a text, a great text. I was actually teaching it the other night, called "The Fire of Love." By someone called Richard Rolle, R-O-L-L-E, 14th century English mystic, Incendium Amoris, the fire of love. And Richard Rolle talks about love as fire, as heat, and as sweetness. Fire and heat and sweetness. And that all sounds pretty good to me. And the text, I mean, the founding text for thinking about all these questions, if there's one thing I could, recommend that you do this evening, it would be to read the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, so-called Song of Solomon, which is this text which somehow ends up in the Hebrew Bible, and then somehow ends up in the Christian Bible. It's a marriage song, it's a love song. It's a love song. And this is okay, so if we want to think about love, I would recommend that we read the Song of Songs. It's 4 pages long. It was probably the text was probably in Aramaic and translated into Hebrew. And it was a song that was probably used at marriage ceremonies. And the great thing about this song is that the first person that speaks in the song is the woman. Actually, the young girl. Most scholars say that she's probably 15, 16. and she is addressing her love to a young man who's probably the same age, and there's this extraordinary drama unfolds between them. But the extraordinary thing about that text is here we have the text that's foundational for all mystical traditions is the Song of Songs. In that text we have an active female voice, an active male voice, and a number of other active voices. And that would be a good place to start, I think, if we're thinking about love. And the question of marriage, I mean, marriage is great. I mean, it's not, I don't think it's, for me, it's the way it's linked to institutions, or marriage as an institution can lead one to a kind of, I think, social conservatism, which I would be skeptical about. But I think the idea that love finds continuity, it finds permanence, insofar as love is permanent, through an act of marriage, I think that's fine. And then the paranoia, and of course the thing with love is the following. We have to think about Shakespeare and think about Othello, one of Shakespeare's heroes, tragic heroes. And Othello is in love with Desdemona, married Desdemona. And but unfortunately, Othello has a bad political consultant whose name is Iago. And Iago hates Othello, but he's Othello's closest consultant, companion. And what Iago does is to insinuate into Othello's mind jealousy. And Othello becomes convinced that Desdemona, his wife, had been unfaithful to him. And because he can't bear the thought of her infidelity, he's consumed by what Shakespeare calls the green-eyed monster. The green-eyed monster of jealousy. And because he can't bear the fact that she's been unfaithful to him, he kills her. He murders her. Now, the thing about that story is that here we have love flipping over into hate and murder. And the thing that we have to take from that is that the same fire that is the fire of love can become the fire of hatred. Right? And so when you're playing with love, you're playing with fire, and you can get your fingers burned. Right? And there are different ways of reading the tragedy of Othello. You could say, you know, the problem with Othello was that he wasn't able to tolerate the fact that he didn't know. Right? He didn't know whether Desdemona had been faithful to him or not. And because he didn't know, he couldn't bear not knowing, he kills her. One way of reading the play, there are other ways, is to say what the play reveals is that love is not knowledge. Love is not knowledge. And this is, I think, a profound insight. Going back to where we began, if you say, I love you, and you want the person, the beloved, to say, I love you too, is that relationship a relationship of knowledge? Right? A relationship of certainty? And it's not. It's an act of faith, an act of trust. And trust can be betrayed, faith can be lost. That's just the kind of thing that human beings do in relationships. If you want more than that, if you want an absolute guarantee at the level of knowledge, then you end up like Othello, murdering the person you love. So I think that the moral of the play is that when it comes to relations of love, we have to learn to trust and have to learn to acknowledge that which we cannot know.
So
Because another person, this is, I think, for me, the most profound dimension of having a relationship to another person is that you can never fully know another person, especially the person you're in love with. The person you're in love with will constantly surprise you, will constantly amaze you.
also myself.
How do you mean?
I really don't know myself totally, completely. It's an enigma for me.
That's a good thing.
But an uncanny thing as well.
Yeah. I think we can't. I don't think we have. I don't think we have self-knowledge. I mean, that's my view. I mean, we have various ideas about ourselves, opinions about ourselves, but they're usually wrong. And so, also, why love is so important is that it's the not the unique, but the privileged space where you can actually learn something about yourself from outside yourself. And it can also break down a bit of that ego and that narcissism. That's the thing. So, we don't, one way of thinking about philosophy is that philosophy is introspection. Right? You turn inward, you start to think. This is not the way to do philosophy. The way to do philosophy is to turn outwards towards the world and towards others. Because inside there isn't really much, right? There's probably a few blog posts or a few tweets or whatever. There isn't really much that's terrible. None of us is that interesting. And that's why we read books, right? Why do we read books? We read books because in reading a book you enter into someone else's mind and someone else's world. And if you read 70 books, you've entered into 70 people's minds and worlds. And most of them are dead. Right? So not only that, by reading, you can communicate with the dead and inhabit these past minds and past worlds. And you can go back thousands of years and empathetically enter into a different way of conceiving things. And that's a way of getting rid of the self-knowledge obsession. Reading books.
But I want to talk about the negation of love. It is generally stated, affirmed that the negation of love is hate. But in my view, hate falls under the category of love. When I passionately hate you, I always dream about you, I always think about you. It's something like love.
Yeah.
So if you agree on this point, what is the very negation of love? Is it, if it is not hate, then what can be?
Indifference. Not caring. Hate is fine. It's fine. Hate is a horrible thing. But hatred is, at least it's something. To hate someone is, as you say, to have powerful feelings about them. Most of human history, that's why relationships with neighbours are so complicated. Right? It's why you can feel good feelings about people on the other side of the world, but people right here, or the people just over the border, you hate them. Right? And so if you look at conflicts, think about the former Yugoslavia as a case point, or think about the conflict around in Ireland, in the relationship between Britain and Ireland over the centuries. It's a hatred which comes out of a deep proximity. Right? So you hate the one that's close, and you love the one that's close. What you have to do is to turn that hate into love. And that's not mean, I'm not recommending hatred, but at least with hatred you've got something to work with. What is worse is indifference.
Yeah. Means that, or liking. Indifference. Yani,
Facebook like.
you know, in sociology and philosophy and also psychoanalysis, we always talk about hatred. Nationalist hatred, hate, racist hate, discriminationism, so on and so forth. But we rarely talk about indifference. For instance, there is a war in Syria. There are millions of people who are injured or suffered from this disaster, immigrants. But as far as I can see, the civilized world are so indifferent about this issue. They don't hate maybe Syrians, the refugees, the immigrants, but they are indifferent. So, as far as I can see, we can say that this is more evil than being racist against Syrians, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, I think that's true. The indifference is worse, or what happens in conflicts is that the individual, the holiness of the human face, the holiness of that dimension of the human being is lost, or we become indifferent to it because we see so much suffering. So why should this suffering get our attention? And you know, I think the situation in Syria is catastrophic, and it's, you know, Syria is in the process of becoming a pawn, becoming an item in the geopolitics of the world, in particular the relationship between the United States, Russia, Iran and various other actors, including Turkey. And that's, I think it's terrible.
Let's talk about faith. Faith. I want to understand at first the link, the relationship between faith and love.
All right. So for me, faith is a subjective act. It's an individual act. And more than that, faith is something which brings the self into being, or at least transforms the self, so that the obvious example is someone like St. Paul. Of course, this happened not that far away from here, where he was. Paul was a Jew, but a Roman citizen. So he had both the privileges of a Roman citizen, which is very rare. The Jews in this period, but he was also a Hebrew, born of Hebrews, as it said. And he has an experience. He's a tax collector. He's making good money. He's a good job. He's a bureaucrat. And there's the moment of transformation on the road to Damascus. The road to Damascus. And the way Paul tells the story is that he has a vision of the resurrected Christ. And that vision of the resurrected Christ causes him to transform himself. And with that vision, he has faith. Now, so faith here would consist in that subjective act where the self, which previously was Saul, tax collector, Roman citizen, member of the Jewish community, who then transforms into Paul. And Paul means basically, is a kind of slang term, little Paul, Paul who was poor, Paul is it becomes somebody without identity, and transforms himself and builds up the churches and all the rest of it does in what's described in the New Testament. Anyway, so faith is that subjective enactment of the self which shifts the self from how it was previously to some new state. So faith is a kind of break. It's not something you can simply inherit. It's something which has to be a kind of a break, a decision. Faith, on my account, can then become a genuine lived commitment through love. Right? So faith has to bind itself in love. And love is what makes that self consistent, coherent over a period of time. So if you just had the experience of faith, you know, you have a vision and you fall to your knees, then you know your phone might go off, and then you decide, okay, I will come to dinner or whatever. Faith is not enough. Faith has to be undergirded, supported through love, and then love itself has to become something much more coherent and political.
What is surprising for us, I mean, French academicians, is that somebody is talking about faith without having a faith to a divine creature, a transcendent thing.
Yeah, faith for me is not theistic. So faith is not. You can have faith in God, and that's fine. But I wrote a book called The Faith of the Faithless, where I want to read this quote because I love this quote. It's also from Oscar Wilde. It's good. And Oscar Wilde says, I'll read it a little bit if I can find it. He says, when I think of religion, I feel as if I would like to found an order for those who cannot believe. The confraternity of the faithless. Right? That's it, there's a faith of the faithless. And he goes on to say, everything to be true must become a religion, and agnosticism should have its ritual no less than faith. So what I take from that is the idea that there is, for someone like me who is, I don't have a particular, I'm not theistic in that sense. But faith is something which I can still have. Right? So faith isn't something that they have. Faith isn't something that those religious fanatics have, and I don't have. What I have is reason. They have faith, I have reason. And that's the way things normally break down. So we have an opposition between people that are religious and people that are not religious. And the people that are not religious think the people that are religious are kind of mad in some way, fanatics in some kind of way. And I'm trying to find a kind of another way of thinking about these things. I think that the one thing that I really am skeptical of, I don't like particularly, is the evangelical atheism of Bush government. Bush government. Bush government. Evangelical atheism of scientific writers, like people like Stephen Hawking and Richard Dawkins. And there's a kind of smug satisfaction that there's a certain kind of atheism which nauseates me. So I'm very interested in religious traditions and how those religious traditions make sense. and how they can be used by people that are not religious like me in order to, because at the very least it's a kind of archive of possibilities which it makes no sense to throw away. Because if you're interested in, for me, I'm an existentialist, right? In the sense in which, for me, philosophy is not some intellectual activity. It's not about concepts and cleverness. Philosophy is something which has to take place at the register of one's existence, right? Of one's personal existence, about how one feels in relationship to others, about these things which transform lives, about conflict, war, love, how life really is. And so what I find in religion, the religion that I know, is a much more visceral understanding of what it means to be a self, a much more existential understanding of what it means to be a self. So I find when I read people like St. Augustine or St. Paul, enormous resources for thinking things out. So I wouldn't want to throw any of that away. So to that extent, I'm always been very interested in different traditions of religious thought.
I want to understand your concept of faith in terms of its difference from belief. Kant left us in a world that is full of theological, ontological, cosmological apparatus. I mean, antinomies of reason, paralogisms of reason, so on and so forth. We really don't know, or it is not the subject of knowledge, whether there is God or not. But, I mean, we always live in a world of doxa, an opinion, a belief.
Yeah.
This is our world. Even though there are lots of scientific knowledges that claim that they are themselves absolute. But philosophically, we can always criticize this sort of proposition. So, my point is that we already live in a world of belief. But you say maybe faith. But you enunciate, you discourse this term in a philosophical way. What is the difference? It is just an awareness that you want.
Between faith and belief.
No. I have beliefs. Maybe I don't know that I have belief. For instance, I believe in scientific knowledge, but I think myself I know something. I absolutely know something. But these are just beliefs according to the philosophical point of view of continental philosophy, including Kant, Hegel, so on and so forth. So we already live in a world of belief that we are obliged to believe. Well, it's necessary to believe.
Yeah.
What is faith then?
Faith is more than that. So, I mean, it depends how you define terms, which is always the philosopher's answer. So, definitions of faith and belief are unstable. The way I understand it is that belief can be said to, I understand by belief, I believe that this is water in the glass, right? And I can justify that belief if it's proven that it's water. So belief for me has that character. Beliefs are kind of empirical claims about the world. Right? So, and it's true that I exist within a world made up by a set of beliefs, which is what Plato called doxa, or opinion. And but faith for me is more than that. Faith is, as I said, this subjective act that cuts through this web of beliefs in a much stronger direction. So I want to make a distinction between belief, which is the way the world can be said to be structured, and faith. And I'm much more simple. Yeah, let's not talk about Kant, because I've got complicated views on Kant. I think he was a good guy. I mean, Kant was trying to. Kant was the first philosopher who accepted completely a scientific view of the world, and he wanted to make room for faith. That was how does one make room for faith in a world explained by science? And to him, that's the faith which turns on the question of what he calls the moral law, which is a way in which a subject can orientate themselves in the world. So I see Kant as a kind of ally, in a way, although I don't like his rationalism.
But
You still okay out there? Just checking in with you.
if you limit the scope of reason,
To make room for faith.
It's
So knowledge to make room.
I mean, yes, there is always a room for faith, but I don't know what is the first step that we take before we believe? We believe in different objects, different things. I believe in God, you not. But what determines our decisions? Maybe it is not a decision.
Nothing. It has to be a free act.
Free act.
Yeah, of course. Faith has to be a free act, otherwise it's not faith.
How can it be free? There are lots of sociological, political, economical, cultural conditions that determines my subjectivity, my point of view, my acts, so on and so forth. How can I be free from those conditions and make a decision? This is the right term? I don't know. Decide to believe.
You can. You do.
I can.
Yeah, you can. Yes, you do.
How can I save myself from those conditions?
Well, you can't. You don't have to. There's the peculiar thing about the world is that the world is for me physics explains the world, the natural world, let's say, rather well. For the social world, we require different kinds of explanations. But that doesn't eliminate the space of freedom. And by freedom there, I mean something quite bizarre. For me, a really important text when I was very young was Dostoevsky and Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground. And Dostoevsky's protagonist in Notes from Underground, called the Underground Man, is a bureaucrat. He's a bureaucrat, and he's a mean bureaucrat, a really mean, hateful bureaucrat. But in this underground life, he has a different set of fantasies. And what particularly animates the Underground Man is the belief that science can explain everything. And he says, the human being, he says, for example, 2 + 2 = 4. 2 + 2 = 4. But the peculiar thing about the human being is that the human being can know that 2 + 2 = 4, and they can say 2 + 2 = 5 is a wonderful thing. There is, if you like, a fundamental, there is an irrationality that human beings have. A sheer kind of unwillingness to be tied down to their conditions. That for me is a kind of evidence of freedom.
It's for me the evidence of Allah. Because I have something
in my Allah, isn't it?
in myself that is more than myself, cannot be reduced to any conditions of life. Right? I have something in myself that transcends unrationally, that I cannot understand, non-symbolizable element I have in myself, right? And this is an object of belief too. Faith, okay. Faith. I have a faith in myself that I am free, because this is an autonomy of reason too that comes toward us, right? We don't know whether we are free or not. Maybe there is a matrix that controls us, that we think that we are free, really free.
Maybe there is.
Maybe there is, but we don't know. But we choose to believe that we are free. And we choose to believe that we are so free that we can transcend those conditions. There is an element in ourselves that is more than those conditions are my consideration of myself.
Yeah, I agree. That's what I said, right? So I agree with you.
This is a miraculous thing.
You can call it that. I mean, I wouldn't, but you could. But I think it's just something that human beings do all the time.
But
through acts of stubborn refusal, resistance, no, I won't tidy up my room. No, I won't do what you want me to do.
I prefer not to.
I prefer not to. I will. And that can be a kind of selfishness, and it can be all of that, but it can also be there's kind of stubbornness that human beings have, which is an unwillingness to be completely determined by the conditions in which they find themselves. And freedom consists at that level, and it's the capacity to make a decision. I mean, the question then is, if you make a decision for Allah, and I make a decision for somebody else, then how do we decide between those two decisions? And that's an interesting question.
Is there an incommensurability between talking about a substance that is free, that can...
It's not a substance.
Not substance, maybe. How can we name it?
I think it's a nothing. I think for me...
It's a void. No?
It's a what?
Void?
No, I think it's more... I'm much more existential than that. I think that we find ourselves in a world where things hang together. There's a set of beliefs, it's familiar. And then there are a set of experiences that a human being can go through, existential experiences, which pull you out of that world. The particular one for me is anxiety. Anxiety is that feeling of the world. If you're feeling anxious, I hope you don't feel anxious now, but when you feel anxious, let's say when you're 15, 16, 17, 18, and the world that you knew and you were sure of begins to appear strange, begins to appear bizarre, and you begin to become aware of yourself over against that world as something which isn't in that world. That's no substance. That's, if you like, that would be the experience of kind of nothingness. It's what Sartre used to call the vertigo of freedom. Freedom is a kind of dizziness. You're not determined by your world, your conditions, your gender role, your place in a family structure. A level, a certain fundamental level, you are free, and that freedom is a kind of vertigo, it's a kind of dizziness. What one then does with that is the question. At that point, because that feeling of vertigo, that feeling of disorientation, in the case of St. Augustine, is what led him to God. Right? So if you look at St. Augustine's Confessions, he experiences this disorientation. I'm summarizing dramatically. He pulls away, he has a kind of nervous breakdown, we would say, and then he hears a voice. He hears a voice which is as a voice of a child. And that child's voice, it's not a real voice, it's an imagined voice, right? It's as if it's a voice. It says, take up and read, take up and read. And he goes inside the house where he's standing outside, he's in the garden where this happening, he goes back inside the house and he opens the Bible and he reads the first sentence he finds. And that sentence, as it were, and that's his moment of conversion. So this experience of freedom and disorientation could lead one towards religious faith in a transcendent being. For me, it doesn't, but the experience is really rather similar.
But this imminent nothingness, which calls us to freedom in ourselves,
Yeah.
something like a transcendent, how can I say,
Transcendent in what sense?
presence, or how can I say, transcendent, I mean, it transcends all conditions.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, it's
Yeah,
not
we
reducible.
no, I mean we are the sort of beings. Firstly, we have a transcendent relation to the world. We're not just stuck in our heads, we're out there in the world making sense of things. First thing to point out. And then secondly, we can step back from that. We can step back from that world and we can ask ourselves the deep philosophical questions. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? And all the rest. In that step back, when I ask those questions at that point, that could then be the beginning of a religious quest, a religious itinerary, or not. So in my case, I use is the wrong word. I read a lot of religious texts, but from this idea of the faith and faithless, this idea that agnostics too can have their faith, and it's not so ludicrous.
And also, agnosticism itself is a faith.
I don't know. Well, it could be. It's what do you mean? So I mean by agnosticism. There's a term that Wilde uses. Agnosticism is invented by Thomas Huxley in the mid-19th century to describe the position of Charles Darwin. It's not a term that Darwin used. It's a term that came into the English language around then. So you can say I'm neither theistic or atheistic, I'm agnostic. I'm not sure. Then what Wilde is trying to capture, the thought which interests me, is that those people without a belief or without the certainty of a belief in a transcendent God can also have faith. Right? So faith isn't something that only those people over there have. Faith is something which people like me can have too. And for that reason, the different religious traditions which we come from are fascinating, deep resources for thinking through what it means to be human.
How much minutes do we have? Good. Okay. My last question, then we can take questions from the audience. As far as I understand,
You're the signer, actually.
yeah, on me. You endeavor to find a way between secularism and theology. Maybe the sublation of both these dualities. And this is very valuable for me. My question is that what is the motivation? What is the impetus behind this style of thinking? And my second question, I observed in Turkey a deep lack in this sort of comprehension, understanding, consideration, in this sort of thought. Are intellectuals so frightened about thinking anything about theology? Why?
I don't mean, in relation to Turkey, I don't know. I've been here for a day, so I'm not going to get into that question.
What is so scary about theology?
Well, no, I mean, for me, it's the other way around. I mean, my context, well, my context, which the last 12 years has been New York and therefore the United States. The political debate is organized around people who have faith, who are generally conservatives on the right, and then those people that are described as liberals, secularists, and they don't have faith. So the way in which, if you looked at the political landscape, say in the early years of this millennium, it was a conflict between kind of secular liberalism and a theistic conservatism. And I think that opposition is questionable because it doesn't take account of the fact that people on the left can also have faith. It doesn't take account of the fact that secularism is also a faith which has its limitations. So I've got a whole number of questions. I mean, another thing to say would be that I think every political state, every country in that sense, has a religious structure. In the sense in which to be a citizen of a country is to be inculcated into a set of rituals, ceremonies, beliefs, a view of history, which for me has a certain religious structure. It's what Rousseau calls civil religion. And so the idea that there are religious fanatics over here and secularists over here is a misapprehension. So countries, for example, like the country I'm from, or let's take another country like France. The idea that France is a secular country overlooks the fact that the French Republic is founded upon a series of kind of articles, a series of beliefs, which have the character of a kind of civil religion. Right? It requires a kind of faith in the Republic as an entity and the ideals for which the Republic stands, which is then what leads to forms of religious conflict. It's the first thing I'd say. Second thing I'd say is that I think that being on the left, as I would describe myself as on the left, and being religious are not necessarily contradictory positions. And to explain that, it would perhaps help to explain a tiny bit about the tradition that I come from, because it's I was a member of the Labour Party in Great Britain for about 10 years. In 84 and 92, I was very active in the Labour Party. And the Labour Party is the party which has been the party of the Socialist Party in Britain. And it has its roots not so much in Marxism as in forms of non-orthodox religious worship and forms of moral association. But what tied people in the Labour Party together was a set of moral beliefs, a sort of ethical commitments, which sometimes had a religious basis. sometimes they do. So the idea of leftism being identified with secularism for me doesn't make any sense, because a lot of the people that I was active with on the left were deeply religious. Right? But their religion was a religion of the holiness of the human being. That could be my religion too. So I think that the choice between secularism and religion it's just part of the story. And a much deeper account needs to be given, and that's what I'd like to see done. That's kind of what I'm trying to do in some of my research.
I love you.
I love you too.
We will take questions from the audience, but they must be written on paper. I will translate.
I'm going to be back in 1 minute.
Okay. Let's take the break.
Well, I'll be one much more.
Okay.
I'll be 1
1
minute
minute.
more.
Bir dakika ara.
We have a lot of questions.
Yes. Let's begin. Start. Question is how power affects faith. For instance, we have political attachments, submissions, commitments, so on and so forth. Maybe with love, but when you have the power in the everyday understanding sense, governmental power, so on and so forth. How the faith will be affected from this condition? This is the first question. The second is, I need to move by your words defining secularism as a form of faith. I wonder what do you think where Head Start falls in this phase of secularism? Because it seems like most secularists act like vampires, exposed to crucified, with counseling, when the subject comes to Head Start. Have you ever read Islamic model? This is a question. For instance, Ibn Arabi, Ghazali.
I have no.
Microphone. Does it work? Silence microphone. Arka taraf duyuyor mu Sayın? Hayır. Duymuyor.
This will, we're back. That's fine. So on Islamic philosophy, yes, Paulie, I have read Al-Farabi and Avicenna, which you call it and Averroes, and I've got some vague knowledge of post-Quranic mysticism, in particular in the Sufi tradition. So it's that. But by no means adequate. So was that it? Yeah. I've written 2 questions. Do you want to answer the first 2 now?
The first one?
So, how does power affect faith?
Yeah.
Badly.
Yeah.
Is the answer. Power affects faith badly. So the Plato thought that philosophers should be kings or queens. He made a complete gender equality in Plato. And the one element of that thought which interests me is that Plato says that philosophers should govern because they don't want power. What they want to do is contemplate the ideas, pursue blessedness, happiness. The last thing they want is political power. Therefore, you should give political power to them. Now, the interesting thought behind that is that the only people that should have political power are those people that do not want it. If anybody wants political power, you should not give it to them. I think this would be a very good axiom in political life. So if you find someone in this room who genuinely doesn't want political power, just a good person who wants to be concerned with, you give them political power. Anybody that wants political power, they're the last people that you should ask, because they'll end up becoming corrupt. It always happens. So that's one lesson from Plato I rather like. The headscarf issue I never really understood. And the way the debate became, I became aware of that debate was in relation to France and the foulard, as it's called in France. And it's that Alan Badiou makes a great remark in a text on the question of the headscarf. He says something like that the principle of today's French Republic is that your head must be, is that bare heads. You must have a bare head. So why would the covering of the head matter so fundamentally to politics? From an English perspective, it doesn't really, I don't really see why it's of such huge importance, one way or the other. I know here it's a huge issue. I don't understand the Turkish context, and I'm not going to get involved with it because that would be stupid. But I'm surprised by how angry it makes.
Thank you very much.